As the Allies liberated many different parts of France following the D-Day invasions, they came across rather disturbing scenes in many French towns and also French villages and cities. Allied troops in the French resistance began to liberate areas, and they were met with many different euphoric scenes as the Germans were sent back towards Germany. However, many Allied soldiers came across a large number of women who were being punished by the French for their horizontal collaboration with the enemy. This was where women were being brutally punished for sleeping with the enemy and were publicly humiliated in shameful scenes. It's estimated that 20,000 women had their heads shaved in public spectacles, which became known as the Ugly Carnivals, and these women were treated barbarically and suffered greatly. These were women whose crime was sleeping with the enemy. Join us today as we look at the horrific torture of the women who slept with the Nazis, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. As the Germans captured and seized large areas of land and different countries, they settled and occupied the areas. Quickly they got themselves comfortable and then started looking for women to either court, take advantage of, or treat terribly. There were many women across occupied lands who took to the Germans and who decided to sleep with German soldiers. There was at the time sometimes in the German army seemingly a trend where many of the French girlfriends of German soldiers would walk around in their boyfriends' uniforms, and pictures of this do exist. Everyone in the Wehrmacht and the military knew that Paris was where they wanted to be. Many Germans believed that it was a place filled with scandalous women who would tend to every desire of the army, and they believed it was in a sense a giant cat house. Conquering soldiers, especially those who were of a significant rank in the military, did have a lot to offer a girl. They could offer them a future they promised that after the war they would marry and then move back to Germany and start a family. There were some women who did take advantage of the fact many German soldiers were lonely and then went to bed with them, but there were also some soldiers who were too happy to take advantage of the women in France, many whose boyfriends and husbands had joined the French army to fight. Some women fell in love and married their German boyfriends, and they followed their husbands wherever they went, even across dangerous lands, and some even joined them inside of prison camps. In France, around 200,000 babies were born to German fathers and French mothers, and this pattern occurred wherever the German army went. In Norway, 12,000 were born, and even on the Channel Islands, 900 babies were born to German fathers, and these were registered. But as the war turned against the Germans and they were pushed back and forced to concede territory, often the liberators and aspects of the resistance went to extreme lengths to punish those women who they believed were collaborating with the Germans and who had slept with the enemy. Horizontal collaboration, as it was known, referred to a romantic or sexual relationship that many women in France or occupied lands had with German occupation forces following the fall of said lands. After the liberation of France, many women were punished in a horrific ordeal for being collaborators, and many of the scenes were truly horrific and barbarous. In Norway, some women who were accused of collaborating in this way were exiled from lands, and were even arrested and thrown in prison. Also, children from these relationships were considered part of the betrayal, and were also exiled and declared illegitimate. In many lands, to sleep with the enemy was considered one of the worst shames and crimes that one could conduct during the Second World War. But in France, a horrific ordeal for many women was carried out, aimed to torture and humiliate them in public for sleeping with their enemies. Many had their heads shaved in public spectacles, with crowds flocking to see members of the resistance cutting the flowing locks from a woman. This was a punishment that dated back to the Dark Ages for adultery, but it was a sign of humiliation and retribution for the French forces. During the Second World War, the Nazi state issued orders that German women who were accused of sleeping with non-Aryans or foreign prisoners on farms should be publicly punished with their heads shaved. But inside French towns, the scenes were incredibly shocking, with crowds baying for the sadistic punishment of the women. The Ugly Carnival, as it was referred to, saw a large number of women brought into town squares, forced to have their heads shaved, and then they were often beaten, hit and abused by other members of the crowds. Crowds would spit and throw things at them, and often they had punishment inflicted upon them. Many were stripped half naked and forced to walk the streets, where crowds would kick and hit them, and beat them sometimes very severely. Some women were badly beaten and bloodied by these attacks, and some were even covered in tar to shame them and make them feel worse and outline what they had done. Many of the women in active revenge also had a swastika drawn on their foreheads or bodies in lipstick or paint, and this showed the whole crowd what they had done. It was said that these women, in the hands of their tormentors, had the look of a hunted animal, and that the French were rounding up collaborators, cutting their hair off and burning it in huge piles, which one could smell miles away. Also, women collaborators were forced to run the gauntlet and were really beaten. One photographer who took a picture of these events wrote, "I saw 4 girls who had been led through the streets and I rushed towards them to take a photograph. At once I found myself at the front of the procession, and the local people thought I was the female soldier who had captured them or something like that, and I was kissed and congratulated at the same time, as slaps and spit rained down on the unfortunate girls." Many of the women were also paraded on lorries throughout towns and cities to show more people what they'd done. Jock Colville, Churchill's private secretary, saw this and stated, "I watched an open lorry drive past, to the accompaniment of boos and catcalls from the French people, with a dozen miserable women in the back. Every hair on their head had been shaved off. They were in tears, hanging their heads in shame. Whilst disgusted by this cruelty, I reflected that we British had not known invasion or occupation for some 900 years, so we were not the best judges." There were also a few men who were shaved for working in German factories, but it was always women who were deemed the first scapegoats. A number of these women were not actually guilty of sleeping with the enemy, but some were wrongly subjected to the ordeal, as they were in conflict with another woman or a man who would tell the resistance on them. A number of women who were also shamed were also abused by the German soldiers, and these scenes of public humiliation were played out all over France. Much of France had suffered under the German occupation heavily, and some Allied soldiers were sympathetic to this, but were still shocked by the torture of the women that was evident. Many women were executed and shot dead by French forces if they were found with German weapons in their possession, even before they had a chance to explain, such was the fear of collaboration. There was a possibility that these weapons were being gathered for the resistance, but soldiers still shot women and also men dead for this. There was also a fear in France of French women supporting the German military, as one report from an American lieutenant of the 1st Infantry Division claimed he had encountered 4 women in German uniforms as snipers in trees, and 5 inside of a town. But many women were targeted as during the occupation they had lived better lives than the rest of the French population, as they had not starved and had been given better food and received many benefits from going with a German soldier, such as trips to different places, and also more lenient treatment by other German officers. It's known that at least 20,000 women were known to have had their heads shaved, and this figure may be higher. In Paris, things were much more extreme, as there were cases of prostitutes and women being kicked to death for accepting German soldiers as clients, and even members of the aristocracy were shaved for being in cahoots with German officers. In some areas of France, much of the conduct of French women and German soldiers was professional. Some women, for example female schoolteachers, who were living alone, were forced to have German soldiers living with them. After the war, these were allegedly punished for laying with German soldiers, but this was not the case in many of them. Many women believed their only way of obtaining food for themselves and their children during the occupation was to collaborate with the enemy. But the scenes of the Ugly Carnival were one of the most shocking of the Second World War, as the violence inflicted upon the women, who were forced to run the gauntlet in towns, or were shaved, sometimes resulted in their deaths and killings. Across France, there was a great moral outrage on these women who had slept with the enemy, and for this their conduct was regarded as the biggest shame imaginable and tantamount to treason. The scenes played out in many French settlements brought great shock to even the most hardened Allied soldier, and today the images of French women without hair and with swastikas branded on them are incredibly haunting. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.